Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Now, normally on Wednesday, during the current study of the Olivet Discourse, I would obviously be continuing my discussion of the Olivet Discourse. However, as many of you know, I recently introduced a brand new book entitled To Telos. Now, I have suggested, I say it on the very back of the book, I say it in the book, this book is a theological atom bomb. If my premises in this book are valid, all futurist eschatologies are completely false. It's that simple. Now, I expected there to be objections, naturally, and that's fine. But let me read to you the premises on the back, as I've stated them on the back of the book. Now, don't forget, for the rest of December, for the rest of December 2022, U.S. orders only. Total delivered price for the book is $12.95. Go to my website, donkpreston.com and BibleProphecy.com. Order the book, save yourself $5. Now, here are my premises that I set out on the back of the book and that I develop within the book. Point number one, virtually everyone agrees that the law of Moses was annulled, never to be restored in the first century. Now, am I aware that there are those who are what are known as Torah observant followers? Yes, I'm fully aware of that. The great majority of Christians, however, certainly do not agree with that, and that's what I'm addressing. Point number two, virtually everyone agrees that in conformity with the law of Moses, the Jerusalem temple, overseen by the Levitical priesthood, was standing, valid, and imposed when the first four of Israel's feast days were fulfilled. Number three, if that temple had to be standing, valid, and imposed for the fulfillment of the first four of Israel's feast days to be fulfilled, upon what basis can it be argued that the same temple would not have to be standing, valid, and binding for the fulfillment of the final three feast days? It is empirically true that that temple is no longer standing. That demands, therefore, that either A, those last three feast days were not fulfilled and can never be fulfilled, since the law of Moses will never be restored, or those final three feast days, which foreshadowed the judgment, the parousia, and the resurrection, were all fulfilled while the law of Moses was still valid and the Jerusalem temple was still functioning in conformity to the law of Moses. Now, that's a mouthful, to be sure. And as I said, I fully expected for there to be resistance and objections. And so I've kept record of the most substantial, in some cases the most vehement, objections. So I'm going to share with you one of the objections. It's actually several objections, several points posted by this one individual, and I won't call names, but that's okay. So let me read to you the majority of the posts. There's some of it doesn't have to be read because it's not totally relevant to the objection, okay? So let me read to you a great deal of the objection. Point number one, the temple did not need to have standing or even be standing for the spiritual fulfillment of God's feast. The Hebrew writer never even mentioned the temple. The most holy place was an empty room in the days before AD 70. The presence of God departed when the ark of God was lost. The book of Hebrews appeals to the original design by God, and the original temple, or tabernacle, was set up outside the camp, just as Jesus was crucified outside, outside the city gates. That's why the writer says, quote, "Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." So the objector is saying, well, because Jesus was crucified outside the gates, that shows that the temple had no significance, had no importance for the fulfillment of the feast days. Well, let me just say, and by the way, for an excellent resource on this, you might check out Ernest Martin's book on, boy, I just went blank on the name of the book. I apologize for that. Got it laying right on my desk in the other room. But it's Ernest Martin's book on the mystery of the temple or something like that. Okay, I apologize for that. Senior moment, don't you know? Here's the point. When the argument is made, well, okay, Jesus, without any question, was sacrificed without the gate, that supposedly signifies that the temple had no meaning whatsoever. This demonstrates a gross misunderstanding and or ignorance of the entire sacrificial cultus. Because you see, when Hebrews chapter 13 makes it a point of going out to Jesus without the camp and of saying Christ was sacrificed outside the camp, this objector is evidently ignorant of the fact that that was in fulfillment of the typological red heifer sacrifice. He is evidently ignorant of the fact that all of the sacrifices had to be disposed of, and many of them were actually offered not only on the altar of burnt offerings in the temple proper, but outside the gate, up on the Mount of Olives, was a special place, but more especially, and this is critical, more especially, and according to Numbers chapter 19, the red heifer sacrifice was offered outside the gates. Well, the Hebrews writer makes it abundantly clear that Christ was the typological or antitype fulfillment of the typological red heifer sacrifice. Now, was the original red heifer sacrifice totally unrelated to the temple? No one believes that. No one teaches that. As a matter of fact, if you pay attention to the dispensational world, what do they tell us? Oh, we got to have the red heifer for the purification of the millennial temple. We got to have the red heifer for the sanctification of the restored priesthood. So no one teaches that the red heifer was unrelated to or unnecessary in relationship to the temple. It is just simply that God ordained it to be sacrificed out there. But the temple itself was purified by the sacrifice of the red heifer. The priesthood, the altar, all of the vessels, the entire cultus was sanctified by the ashes of the red heifer offered outside the gate. Without the ashes of the red heifer, there was no atonement. Without the ashes of the red heifer, there was no cleansing for sin. And where did all that take place? Oh, in the temple. You know, Yom Kippur, sacrifice on the altar that had been cleansed by the blood of the red heifer offered outside the gate. So the objection that Christ was offered outside the gate, supposedly meaning that the temple was unimportant, insignificant, and had no role in the fulfillment of the feast days, and no importance in regard to the temple, it is just sadly misguided. It is sadly ignorant of the entire significance of the red heifer sacrifice. Thus, the argument itself, the objection itself, is based upon an ignorance of the Levitical priesthood, the temple cultus, and the red heifer sacrifice. The objector then says, the corrupt priests and leaders running Herod's temple were of no interest to the writer of Hebrews. Well, once again, this flies in the face of the facts. Now, this same objector admits in his post that yes, the first 4 feast days were fulfilled while the temple was still standing and still valid. Okay, so if the temple and the priesthood was still standing and still valid, and by the way, Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 to 4 tells us, guess what? If Christ were on earth, he could not serve as high priest, seeing that there are priests who serve. Where did they serve? Where were they serving? In the temple, and they were doing so, quote, according to the law. Now, am I saying that the Levitical priesthood in the days of Jesus was somehow pure and holy and sanctified, as they ought to have been? No, but they were genealogically confirmed. And when you admit that the first 4 feast days were fulfilled while the temple and the priesthood, no matter how defiled, okay, if you're going to argue that, okay, the priesthood was defiled, therefore the first 4 feast days were not really fulfilled, okay, then they weren't fulfilled. But you see, Jesus understood very well of how defiled the priesthood was. But when he cleansed the leper, I think it's Luke chapter 5, is it not? He healed 10 lepers. Only one of them came back. Actually, when he healed them, he told them, go show yourself to the priests. Well, that's that corrupt priesthood. Why would Jesus tell those cleansed lepers, go show yourself to the priest, if the priesthood was not important? It's because Jesus understood the law was still standing. And it was clearly still valid. And it was important to submit to the priest who served according to the law. And so this objection that, quote, the corrupt priests and leaders running Herod's temple were of no interest to the writer of Hebrews. Well, they were important to Jesus. Go show yourself to the priest. And they were important to the writer of Hebrews who said they serve according to the law. This is what I call an argumentum ad desperatum. Okay, the objector then says the original Passover was observed in Egypt. Jesus and his disciples observed it in an upper room, not in the temple run by the Jews who wanted him dead. All of the feasts were observed for many years before Jerusalem was even a city of Israel, and for centuries before the first temple was built by Solomon. It's all about the tabernacle of meeting with God. Then he says this. It's the timing of those feasts that really matters, because they were under the authority of God, not Moses. Well, wait a minute, folks. Leviticus chapter 23 was written by Moses as commanded by God. There is no dichotomy between the authority of God concerning the feast days and the authority of Moses concerning the feasthood. That is a false desperation argument. Did Moses write that chapter of Leviticus chapter 3? Oh, and by the way, of Numbers chapter 28 and of Deuteronomy? He didn't do that by his own authority. So once again, this is argumentum ad desperatum. But let me continue. Quote, the Passover feast and the associated unleavened bread were instituted in Exodus 12 to 13. The Passover was first observed in Egypt, which was hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. There was no law of Moses at the time. Pardon me. No Levitical priesthood, no temple, no tabernacle, just the word of God in the form of his voice. This was preparatory for the first covenant. Blood would be sprinkled to dedicate it at a later time at Sinai. Thank you. Exactly right. You see, the entire argument here that says that the only thing that really mattered was the time, number one, that is specious and false as it can be. And obviously, the distinction between the control and the authority of God versus the authority of Moses, totally false. I mean, that's a false dichotomy, a false contrast. But he says, the Passover feast and the associated unleavened bread instituted in Exodus 12 to 13. The Passover was first observed in Egypt, which is hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. Absolutely correct. But then he gave the farm away when he said all of that was preparatory for the first covenant. That's right. It was preparatory for the time when God would choose the place for sacrifice to be offered to him, at which time no other place could be used. Let me read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 12. Whoops. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, the Lord says, I'll begin with verse 5. You shall seek the place. Now I want you to pay careful attention to the use of the term place and the word there that is used no less than 5 times. Okay? And the specific prohibition that God gives in this text. So let me begin. But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all of your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there shall you go. See? Where and there, twice. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, your wave offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. And there, see, there, out of all the tribes, God was going to choose a place where he would meet them. There they would offer their sacrifice. Now watch. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your household, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. Now watch. You shall not at all do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For as yet you have not come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so then you dwell in safety, then there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your land, and all your choice offerings which the Lord your God commands you. So, here is Moses, God through Moses, writing and speaking before Sinai, before entrance into the land, before the choosing of Jerusalem. You got that? And God says, I'm going to choose a place. There, 5 times. Where, at least 1 time. You will come and you will meet me there. I will meet you there. And furthermore, once you enter the land and once I choose that place, you will not offer your sacrifices like we're doing right now, like they did in Exodus in offering the Passover. Like they did during the wilderness wandering as they observed the Passover. Numbers chapter 14. No. Once you enter the land, once I choose the place, you will not offer your sacrifices anywhere but there. And so when this objector says, the place is totally irrelevant, well, at one time it was. Before the giving of the law, before the choosing of the place. And so, this entire objection is absolutely false. It is an argument based upon anachronism. It ignores the fact that, well, in Egypt, the law had not been given. Moses had not written Deuteronomy 12. God had not uttered Deuteronomy chapter 12. They had not entered the land. God had not chosen the place. And by the way, let me make this observation. If place was unimportant, and by the way, you're not going to get any Jew whatsoever to agree that place was not important. But anyway, in Exodus chapter 34, verse 23, you know, the time of the giving of the law, but before they've entered the land, God said 3 times a year. Now, remember, he's talking about the time when he's given them the land. He's talking about the time after he has chosen the place where he will meet them and where they are to offer their sacrifices. The Lord says, 3 times a year, all of your men shall appear before me. And you know what? He made a promise. When you travel from your foreign lands, when you travel from your cities, and you meet me there, no enemy will desire your land. Look, folks, here is God emphasizing where the sacrifices, where the feast days were to be observed. And remember, God said, when I choose that place, you are not to observe these things anywhere else. Now, he made provision that in case it was too far, something happened, unforeseen contingencies. Okay, he made provision for that. But the law still was, I'm going to choose a place. It's there that you're going to offer your sacrifices, and you're not supposed to offer your sacrifices or observe these feast days anywhere else. And thus, this entire argument is based upon either an ignorance of Deuteronomy chapter 12 or a willful ignoring of Deuteronomy 12, Exodus 34, 23, and a host of other verses that we could adduce. So, and by the way, this objection was repeated by several different people, and so having nullified and answered and refuted that objection, I won't repeat that objection again. That's been offered by different people. Now, another objection, which we're not going to cover today, we'll cover this at another time, has to do with the priesthood. And again, the fact that temple was not important. In the meantime, let me ask you, please, if you haven't purchased the book, do so. And spend some time on my discussion of Hebrews chapter 9, 6 to 10. I know it doesn't use the word tabernacle, and I'll say more about that at a later time. It's a totally irrelevant argument. Absolutely, totally irrelevant. But spend some time on my discussion of Hebrews chapter 9, 6 to 10, and more especially, spend some time, go to BibleGateway.com and look up Hebrews chapter 9, 6 to 10, and examine it and read it in a lot of different translations, and notice the use of the present tenses that are used there, because they're important. Okay, like I promised you, this will be my last video for this week, taking some time off to enjoy the family and the Christmas vacation time. Thank you so much for joining me, and listen, I hope you have a fantastic Christmas on Sunday. I hope you'll be safe. Be sure to express your love to the people that you love. Okay? Gifts are not important. Your love is what is important. So be sure to share that and be sure to express that. And I'll be back with you on Monday. God bless.